The night begins without sound, and the world seems to take a long breath before falling into stillness. The air moves slowly through forgotten spaces, carrying the faint scent of dust, ash, and rain. Somewhere, a single flame flickers, its light trembling over stone walls worn smooth by centuries. You drift backward through time, past the restless pulse of the modern world, into an age made of patience and touch, a world of wood, water, and quiet invention. There is no noise of machines here, only the rhythm of human breath and the low hum of effort that built the shape of living. What follows is not a tale of conquest or discovery, but of understanding, of how life, through countless small errors and fragile moments, learned the art of safety. Each sound in this memory carries meaning: the soft strike of a hammer against bronze, the creak of a door, the gentle whistle of air escaping through cracks in stone. All of it becomes a language, slow and deliberate. These are the quiet inventions of survival, the humble beginnings of care. People moved carefully through a world they did not yet control, guided by instinct more than knowledge. Fire warmed them and threatened them. Water sustained them and swallowed them. From these opposites, they shaped the balance that allowed them to endure. In their hands, safety was not a certainty but a rhythm, learned, forgotten, relearned, the pulse that followed every act of creation. If you listen, you can almost hear the centuries turning, slow as the tide. The wind slides through wooden beams, the fire sighs beneath iron, footsteps echo softly in corridors that no longer stand. Each mistake of the past becomes a seed of wisdom, each risk a step toward calm. It is not progress that defines this journey, but attention, the simple awareness of how to keep life steady against the weight of time. The world they built was imperfect, yet patient. It learned by burning, by falling, by breaking, until stillness itself became the greatest invention. And so the story begins, not with glory or fear, but with a long exhale. The night holds its silence like a promise. You are part of it now, carried on the same breath as those before you. The lessons of safety, of balance, of gentle persistence are waiting in the quiet. All you need to do is listen. The moats reflection. Before the high walls and watchtowers rose above the land, before stone learned the language of strength, the first defense of a fortress was not made by hands, but by water. Around every castle, a slow ring of liquid glass shimmered beneath the sky. The moat was not only a boundary, it was a mirror, a quiet surface where the sky bent to touch the earth. Its calm appearance hid a depth that did not forgive. The moat was the breath between safety and surrender, a creation born from fear, from foresight, from the desire to sleep unguarded for one more night. It lay still beneath the bridges, reflecting clouds, torches, and the long shadows of men who believed themselves untouchable. Yet water remembers everything, and in its reflection, it kept count of both victories and mistakes. The builders of the early Middle Ages knew how to carve stone and lift timber, but they did not yet understand the patient weight of what they built. They dug moats to keep danger out, but rarely thought of what might fall in. The trench filled with rainwater, runoff, and sometimes the nearby stream, becoming a living thing of its own, dark, slow, and cold. During the day, it glimmered softly beneath sunlight. At night, it vanished into shadow, an invisible ring of silence around the sleeping walls. Those who lived inside the castle spoke of it with respect, as if it were another resident, unseen but always near. Children would peer over its edge and see their faces ripple and break. Servants crossing the narrow bridges did so carefully, their lanterns trembling above the black water. Knights, still drunk from victory feasts, laughed at the danger until one step too far turned laughter into quiet. Few of them could swim. In that age, the art of swimming was almost unknown, seen as something wild, even suspicious. The body, heavy with armor or cloth, sank quickly. The water closed without a sound. The moat did not need malice to kill, only patience. It waited beneath every bridge, beneath every careless step, beneath every hurried errand at dawn. When someone fell, the cry was brief. The ripples spread outward and then were gone. In the morning, only the floating torch or the drifting shoe remained as a sign that the moat had claimed another. And so the moat that protected the living became the quiet grave of the same people it was meant to keep safe. In time, the castle dwellers began to notice the pattern, not through sudden revelation, but through loss repeated until memory could no longer ignore it. The water reflected not only the stars, but the faces that vanished beneath them. Servants whispered prayers when crossing bridges. Children were forbidden to play near the edge. The builders, whose hands had shaped the very stones, began to tie ropes along the sides, thick cords twisted from hemp, meant to give something to grasp in the moment between life and drowning. Lanterns were hung to mark the bridges, their golden light trembling like small suns above the black ring. Guards were posted, not for war, but for watching. And even then, the water still took those who underestimated its calm. There is something ancient in the way water teaches. It does not shout or warn. It reflects. The moat, in its endless stillness, became a teacher to those who lived by it. The people learned that protection and danger were never far apart, that what defends can also destroy. The moat was the first mirror of awareness, the first quiet reminder that safety is not the absence of risk, but the constant recognition of it. When the builders reinforced the walls, they began to build not only against enemies, but against themselves. Bridges widened, ropes thickened, stones along the edge were carved smooth, so those who slipped might have something to grasp. The water remained dark, but now it held the light of understanding. Each reflection of a torch upon its surface was like a small truth made visible. Life in the castle changed in subtle ways. The guards, once posted only to watch for intruders, began to watch the people within. At night, their footsteps echoed softly on the wooden bridges, accompanied by the gentle lapping of water against stone. The moat no longer belonged only to fear. It had become a companion to vigilance. Within its circle, the idea of safety took its first breath. Fragile, uncertain, but alive. Imagine the castle from above, the ring of stone walls, the towers, and beyond them, the circle of water catching the moonlight. Inside, the fires burn low, the people sleep. Outside, the world is vast and quiet, filled with distant forests and the hum of unseen creatures, and between them, between danger and rest, lies that ring of reflection, both barrier and bond. It holds everything together in a fragile piece. The water knows what the people have not yet learned, that every act of protection carries its own shadow, that care and control must move in rhythm, or both will sink. The moat whispers these lessons endlessly, though few stop to listen. As years pass, the moats grow wider, deeper, and sometimes dry altogether, filled instead with stakes or stone. Yet even when drained, their memory remains in the shape of the land, a hollow curve carved by centuries of cautious hands. Travelers who cross these dry ditches today may not notice them, but beneath the grass lies the same old truth, that human safety is never born from perfection, but from patience. Every rope once tied, every lantern once lit, every guard once stationed by the water's edge, they were not signs of fear, but of awareness. In each gesture, there was acceptance that the world could not be fully controlled, only carefully observed. And so the moat became more than a structure. It became a quiet symbol of the human condition, the fragile line between inside and outside, between safety and surrender. It reflected the sky, but also the hearts of those who built it, calm above, restless beneath. For every stone placed upon the wall, a drop of water waited below to remind them of humility. The castle may have stood proud, but the moat taught balance. The water taught stillness, and stillness, in time, became wisdom. Now the world has changed. The castles have crumbled, and their moats have turned to ponds, gardens, and forgotten hollows. But in their reflection, the lesson endures. Safety does not arrive from power, nor from walls, nor from height. It comes from attention. The same careful gaze that once hung lanterns along the bridge, that once tied ropes above the dark. The moat remains, even if unseen, circling not the castle now, but the memory of all that was learned beside it. In its still, ancient water, you can almost see the reflection of every life that passed. The flicker of a torch, the ripple of movement, the quiet endurance of understanding. And when you stand beside that calm surface, you may find that it mirrors more than the past. It mirrors your own quiet need for balance, your own instinct to survive without haste, your own wish to be safe in a world that moves too quickly. The moat, once dug to keep others away, now teaches how to remain present, to stand at the edge, to see both depth and light, and to know that safety begins not in distance, but in awareness. In the end, that circle of water was not only a defense of stone, but a reflection of the human spirit itself. Calm, fragile, and endless. The birth of the helmet. Across the long, open fields of the early world, where the horizon was wide and the sound of hooves carried farther than voices, men once rode into battle with nothing to guard their heads but courage. The air there was raw and metallic, heavy with the scent of soil and smoke. Flags rippled above them like streaks of cloud, bright against the grey of dust and sky. The wind cut through the noise of shouting and steel, and beneath it all was the pulse of the earth, slow, deep, unending. Before the age of armor, before the mind of war had learned restraint, the head was left bare to the sun, to the arrow, to the sudden fall of iron. And though bravery carried men forward, it could not protect them from the silence that followed. In time, after too many fell beneath the same weight of sound and fear, the thought arose. Perhaps endurance did not come from strength, but from care. Perhaps courage could live alongside caution. The first helmets were crude, almost uncertain of their purpose. Sheets of hammered bronze or iron were bent by hand, shaped roughly into domes that fit more by instinct than design. They were heavy, uneven, and dim inside, more a burden than a shield. Yet they changed something profound. The first man who placed one upon his head must have felt not power, but quiet. The roar of the world softened. The clang of metal became distant, muffled by the small chamber of air between skull and steel. The mind, enclosed in its narrow space, began to think differently. War no longer sounded like thunder, but like the hum of breath. For the first time, danger was met not by open defiance, but by reflection. The simple understanding that to endure was to hide what could not be replaced. In those early days, each helmet bore the mark of its maker. No two were the same. Some were wide and flat, others tall and conical, some decorated with crests, others left plain and dull. The blacksmith's hammer determined the curve of survival. Every strike of metal was a promise between craftsman and soldier. I cannot keep you alive, but I can delay the end. The soldiers who wore them learned quickly how sound changed inside the helmet. Every breath echoed, every heartbeat seemed amplified. The narrow slit for vision framed the world like a painting, a small rectangle of sky, of movement, of uncertainty. In that narrow view, focus became instinct. The soldier no longer saw everything. He saw what mattered most. The air inside was hot and dry. The metal drew heat from the sun and sweat from the skin. But discomfort was a small price for the gift of time, the moment's difference between life and death. Beneath the heavy crown of iron, the mind adapted to a slower rhythm. Breath became deliberate, movement became measured. Every motion of the neck, every glance was now an act of calculation. And through that slowness came clarity. The helmet, once a mere object, became an extension of awareness, a reminder that survival depends not on fury, but on control. Over generations, the shapes evolved. Blacksmiths studied how blows landed, how arrows glanced, how air moved. The domes became smoother, the edges curved to deflect rather than absorb. Padding was added beneath, layers of linen or wool soaked in vinegar or oil to soften the shock of impact. Holes were drilled for breath, small enough to keep out a blade, wide enough to let the world whisper through. Visors were added next, hinged to lift or lower, creating a thin boundary between the chaos of battle and the stillness of thought. To lower a visor was to enter solitude, the quiet chamber where sound turned inward and time seemed to slow. Soldiers described the sensation as both comforting and isolating. Within the iron walls, they were alone with their heartbeat, their fear, and their purpose. As the centuries moved, the helmets became not only stronger, but more human in form. The face was carved into the metal, blank, expressionless, eternal. In the reflection of polished steel, one could no longer tell where man ended and armor began. The helmet became both protector and disguise. Behind it, no one saw exhaustion or hesitation. It created equality in fear. Beneath the same weight, every soldier looked alike, the nameless rhythm of survival beating beneath identical shells. In that anonymity, something changed in the nature of war itself. The battlefield became a sea of glinting heads, thousands of small suns catching the light of destruction and reflecting it back toward the heavens. But for those who lived within the armor, there was another world, one made of muffled sound and narrow air, where the horizon was reduced to inches, and every gesture carried the weight of restraint. It was here, within the small darkness of the helmet, that humanity learned the balance between aggression and defense, between speed and stillness. The helmet did not make men invincible, it reminded them of fragility. It turned the roar of war into a whisper of endurance. The blows that once crushed bone now slid away with a dull ring. The helmet taught the lesson of redirection and that resistance need not be rigid, that survival can be an act of yielding. As time went on, the helmet's form found beauty in function, the curve of the neck guard, the flared edges of the visor, the polished line along the brow. All were born not from vanity, but from the precision of necessity. And yet within that necessity a strange grace appeared. The helmet became a symbol of quiet dignity, of the human desire to preserve what is fragile through design. Its iron gleam held both menace and mercy. To the onlooker, it was a face of war. To the wearer, it was the soft chamber of thought, where fear met focus. When the wars ended and peace returned, the helmets did not disappear. They hung upon walls, were buried with their owners, or passed down as heirlooms. Each carried stories pressed into its surface, scratches, dents, traces of impact. Each scar was a conversation between man and danger, between chance and protection. The helmets, silent and still, became monuments to the idea that wisdom grows from repetition, that progress is not loud but patient. Even when rust claimed their color, the message remained clear. To protect is to care. To endure is to listen. Today, those same helmets rest in museums, their metal dulled to the color of earth. Yet when one looks closely, the faint glimmer of life still stirs within them. Under the right light, you can see the marks of the hammer, the uneven edge where a craftsman's hand once trembled. You can almost hear the breath that once filled the space inside. They are not relics of violence, but of thought, reminders that the mind learns safety not through invention alone, but through the humility of failure repeated until it becomes wisdom. In the long silence of history, the Iron Crown still speaks softly. It tells of a time when people began to understand that endurance is not the absence of danger, but the act of meeting it with awareness. Each improvement, the padding, the air hole, the curved edge, was not merely invention, it was care made visible. The helmet was humanity's first small declaration that life deserved protection. In its quiet, metallic darkness, the idea of safety took shape, not as a fortress, not as a wall, but as a shell around the most delicate part of being. And from that shell, a new rhythm of survival began, slow, patient, deliberate, the echo of iron and breath that still hums beneath every act of preservation today. Stone edges, the walls that guarded heights. Across the wide stretch of medieval sky, the builders of cathedrals and towers moved as if in conversation with the light itself. They lifted stone upon stone toward the heavens, tracing shapes of devotion, ambition, and beauty against the pale blue air. Their hands were calloused, their balance uncertain, their eyes steady with focus. Beneath them, the cities breathed in smoke and silence. Above them, the wind pressed close, cool and unyielding. Every height they reached was both triumph and risk, each new level built upon patience, each step upon the scaffolding a negotiation with gravity. The air was sharp, the drop endless. They did not yet know the full meaning of safety, they only knew the longing to rise. In those centuries, there was no boundary between creation and danger. The builders climbed upon wooden frames lashed together with rope and faith. They carried blocks of limestone, chisels, and buckets of mortar, trusting their feet to narrow planks that creaked with every gust of wind. From the ground, their movements looked almost weightless, dark figures suspended between sky and earth. Yet every few weeks the silence of work would break, a shout, a snap, a fall, and then only stillness. The air would swallow the sound, leaving behind a single tool spinning on stone, a mark of where a life had slipped from the rhythm of the build. It was not cruelty that allowed it, it was ignorance. The idea of protection had not yet been carved into the language of architecture. The tower rose not through security, but through repetition, through the unspoken hope that those who fell had taught the next how not to. Over time, as the great spires of Europe took shape in Chartres, in Florence, in Cologne, something began to shift. The masons, who had once thought only of balance and faith, started to see the geometry of safety in the very lines they drew. Each column, each arch, each supporting beam was not just structure but care made visible. The builders began to carve small walls along the edges of walkways, short railings of stone that caught the eye only when needed. They were not decoration nor defense, but memory, quiet memorials to the ones who had fallen before. Each block set into place was a gesture of remembrance, an unspoken agreement between ambition and restraint. These walls, simple and low, became the first architectural form of safety. They were rarely noticed in their time. Visitors to the cathedrals saw the stained glass, the vaults, the high ceilings, but not the patient lines of stone that followed the edges of the walkways. Yet those lines carried meaning. They said, "Here the body stops, here the dream must pause before it turns to loss." They turned the height into something human, manageable, measured. And through them, architecture learned humility. For the builders, these additions changed the rhythm of work. The scaffolds grew steadier, the ledges broader, the sound of chisels echoed with more calm, the workers less hurried. They no longer built as though racing against time, they built as though holding it still. Each day's progress was a quiet conversation with both gravity and grace. They learned to place not only stones but pauses, small spaces of safety between effort and risk. In these pauses one could breathe, look outward, and realize that height itself did not need to be defied, only understood. When the first cathedrals were finished, their walls gleamed pale under sunlight, their spires sharp as quills writing across the sky. People came to marvel at their vastness, unaware that the same stones that inspired awe had once inspired fear. Inside the great naves, the air moved softly, carrying the scent of wax and dust. The light filtered through colored glass, scattering red and blue patterns upon the floor. The builders who had survived stood quietly among the visitors, unseen, their eyes tracing the lines of the railings they had carved by hand. They knew that beauty had been bought with caution, that every wall of safety was also a wall of memory. Over the years, as new towers and bridges appeared, the lesson of stone edges became law. The idea spread that the boundary between life and fall must be drawn not by luck, but by design. Every new structure carried a whisper of the same awareness. The castles built upon cliffs had their parapets. The monasteries high in the mountains had their low stone fences. Even the smallest cottages began to include thresholds and steps designed with care so that the body might move without fear of misstep. The architecture of safety had begun to weave itself into every corner of human life, not through command, but through quiet imitation. And yet these edges were never loud. They did not demand admiration. They were modest, solid, always waiting. To touch one was to feel the patience of the world made tangible, the steady intention to preserve balance without halting motion. In this, the stone wall became a kind of meditation. It was both barrier and comfort, both ending and beginning. The masons understood this even if they could not name it. To them, the act of carving a guardrail was no less sacred than shaping a column. Each stone was a sentence in the story of endurance, each groove a pause for breath within the long ascent of human thought. Through centuries, the walls remained. They gathered moss, weathered storms, absorbed centuries of footsteps. Children ran their hands along their surfaces. Travelers leaned against them to rest, and pigeons built their nests within their cracks. They became part of life itself, so familiar that few questioned their presence. But in their silence, they continued to teach. They reminded all who stood beside them that beauty without balance is fleeting, and that ambition without attention leads always to fall. Today, when architects trace the outlines of modern buildings, when glass replaces stone and metal replaces wood, the same principle still moves quietly beneath their designs. The balcony railing, the staircase edge, the bridge barrier, all descend from those first low walls carved centuries ago by hands that had seen too much loss. Each line drawn today carries the echo of those lessons. The modern world, though faster and brighter, still leans upon the same truth, that safety is not a separate invention, but the slow refinement of care. And if one stands upon the heights of any city now, looking down at the lines of railings and parapets that crown the buildings, one can feel that same pulse of history. The air moves differently near the edge, just as it did centuries ago, cool, alert, steady. The hand that reaches for the stone does not do so out of fear, but out of recognition. The touch connects present to past, flesh to memory. The builders of the old towers are gone, but their wisdom remains beneath every fingertip that rests upon a wall. In the quiet of those moments, when wind brushes against the skin and the distance below stretches wide, it becomes clear that the real triumph of architecture was never its height, but its restraint. The cathedrals reached upward not to escape the earth, but to find balance between weight and air, between dream and safety. The low walls that guard their edges still whisper the same message: rise, but with care. Build, but with awareness. And in that awareness, the human story finds its steadiness again. One stone at a time, one quiet edge at a time, holding the world gently in place. The invention of the lid. In the still hours of medieval nights, when castles slept beneath their roofs of timber and slate, there was a sound that no one wished to hear, the echo of something falling into darkness. Within the high walls and narrow corridors where torches burned low and footsteps were cautious, the simplest acts of life carried quiet danger. The toilet, that hidden necessity, was once an open hole carved into the outer walls of fortresses and keeps. It hung above the abyss, a wooden seat suspended over the air, with nothing beneath but a pit or a stream that ran unseen below. There was no barrier, no safeguard, only the fragile trust between balance and gravity. To live among stone and shadow meant learning to move carefully, for the line between routine and peril was thinner than breath. These medieval latrines, known in their time as garderobes, were both essential and treacherous. They opened directly to the outside world, where wind and weather moved freely. In winter, the air that rose through them was sharp with frost. In summer, it carried the heavy scent of what the castle could not keep. The seat was often carved from a single plank of oak, polished only by use, worn smooth by the years. It was, in its own way, an act of engineering, a bridge between necessity and fear. But in the darkness beneath, there was always uncertainty. The shaft that fell away into shadow was not always deep, but it was unforgiving. Those who slipped were rarely seen again, for the pit was both unseen and unreachable. In a world where few could swim and fewer dared descend, the fall was as final as any wound. The people of the time did not yet speak of safety as we do now. Their concern was not comfort, but function. Still, memory works quietly, and the memory of loss leaves marks in wood and habit alike. Too many servants vanished during night visits, too many guests stumbled in the dark after feasts. Stories spread through households like soft warnings, of the lady who rose too quickly, of the child who leaned too far, of the guard who mistook shadow for footing. These were not tales of fear, but of remembrance. And slowly, through repetition and grief, the idea of the lid began to take form. At first, it was nothing more than a flat board, set loosely over the hole to keep out the cold and the smell. But function often carries wisdom within its simplicity. Someone, a carpenter perhaps, or a housekeeper, noticed that the board could serve another purpose: protection. When closed, it turned the opening into a surface, a firm divide between presence and void. The hinge followed, a quiet addition that allowed movement without effort. And from that hinge came something new, the power to choose between exposure and safety, between necessity and stillness. It was a modest invention, invisible in grandeur, but profound in effect. The lid was more than wood and metal. It was the first architectural gesture toward privacy as preservation. It transformed a place of risk into a place of pause. Within its small circle, the human desire for control found a tangible form. Those who lifted it in darkness did so knowing they would not fall. They could move without fear, even in silence. It was a change so ordinary that no one marked its beginning, yet its presence spread through every home, from castle to cottage, like an unspoken comfort. What had once been a perilous necessity became, with one hinge and one thought, a safe routine. The invention carried with it a quiet shift in the way people understood their surroundings. The world had always been vast and indifferent, filled with storms, fires, and illness. But here, in this small, contained act, humanity learned to control a corner of it. To cover the opening was to draw a boundary, to define a private world that answered to its own care. The lid, like a door or a wall, separated the body from danger, but unlike the castle gate or the fortress wall, it did so not through strength, but through simplicity. In its closed position, it offered safety. In its open one, it offered necessity. Between them, balance was found. As centuries turned, the object evolved. The rough wood became smooth, the hinge more refined, the edges rounded to fit the hand. In manor houses, the seats were lined with fabric, in monasteries, carved with care. Even as cities rose and sanitation changed, the principle endured. That protection could exist within intimacy, that safety could be humble. The lid became one of the first tools of human dignity, not through luxury, but through thoughtfulness. And though few noticed it, every lift and closure of that simple cover was an echo of the same understanding, that awareness transforms danger into calm. It is easy now, in the quiet comfort of modern rooms, to forget how many centuries of hesitation shaped that small gesture. Yet the same instinct that carved stone railings on towers also guided the hand that added a hinge to wood. Both were born from observation, from the soft rhythm of human caution repeating itself until it became design. The lid was not a grand invention. It did not require armies or scholars. It was the result of a single moment of thought that the body deserves a boundary between itself and harm. From that thought grew one of the first acts of domestic safety, the unseen architecture of peace that still shelters daily life. When morning came in the old castles, sunlight would fall through narrow windows, touching the boards of the garderobe seats. Dust motes floated in the air like small golden memories. The lid, closed and silent, waited without announcement. It did not boast its usefulness, but its presence changed everything. The chamber no longer felt perilous. Servants moved with less caution. Children no longer feared the dark corner of the room. In its stillness, the lid offered a kind of order, the quiet assurance that even in the most private, vulnerable moments, thought could shape safety. And when the centuries passed and the old castles crumbled into ruins, the garderobes remained. The wooden lids long since decayed, but the stone seats still sit along the walls, their openings sealed by time. In the cold light of modern discovery, archaeologists study them as relics of medieval life. Yet within their silence lies something larger, the trace of understanding that survival is built not only upon walls and weapons, but upon attention. Each hinge that once turned, each board that once closed, was an act of care as real as any fortress built for kings. So the invention of the lid stands as one of history's gentlest revolutions, a reminder that even the simplest human thought can bend the path of risk towards safety. It asks for nothing but awareness. It offers nothing but peace. And in its modest way, It became the first whisper of comfort in the architecture of the home, the quiet boundary between the body and the abyss, between fear and rest, between silence and survival. Light without destruction. Before the hum of electricity, before the quiet certainty of switches and bulbs, there was only the trembling light of flame. Every home, from the smallest hut to the grandest hall, lived by its flicker. The candle was both comfort and threat, both warmth and warning. It softened darkness but never promised safety. Its glow was alive and breathing, moving, unpredictable. A small draught could tilt its flame, a careless hand could end an entire street, yet no one could live without it. Light was life, and life was risk. To see in the night meant to trust the same force that could consume everything you loved. In the earliest nights of the world, the first flames burned freely, unbound by wall or frame. Torches were carried through corridors of stone, the air thick with smoke and soot. The people of the Middle Ages understood fire as both companion and sovereign, a spirit that gave warmth to the body and fear to the mind. The hearth was its temple, the candle its messenger. And yet, for all their reverence, they were never far from disaster. The scent of burning linen, the slow crackle behind a door, the roar that followed, these were sounds that turned feasts into ruins. Villages vanished overnight, not from war or storm, but from the gentle, familiar glow that once promised safety. It was in this uneasy balance that the idea of protection began to take form. At first, it was simple, a circle of stone around a hearth, a basin of clay beneath a torch, a holder carved from metal to keep the wax upright. But even these small gestures changed the rhythm of living. To contain fire was to shape order from chaos. The flame, once wild and untamed, began to learn stillness. Families gathered around the light not in fear, but in quiet trust. The glow became part of the home, a heart that pulsed softly in the center of the night. And in that transformation, humanity took another step toward peace. Then came the frame, a thin ring of metal placed around the candle to guard its movement. It was born not from luxury, but from necessity. Too many curtains had caught, too many tables had burned. The frame held the flame upright when the air stirred, or when the hand trembled. From that frame grew the cage, a delicate web of brass or iron enclosing the light without smothering it. The fire, once free to dance and destroy, was now held gently within lines of human intention. The lantern was born not from invention alone, but from observation. The understanding that control does not mean suppression, and that safety need not silence beauty. The lantern spread quickly across the world. In city streets and along the decks of ships, its glow guided travelers through fog and storm. In mountain villages, it burned through the long winters, its faint pulse seen through frosted windows like a promise of endurance. Its light was steadier, its danger less. For the first time, people could walk with fire in hand without fear of losing everything they carried. The flame became transportable, not a god to be worshipped, but a companion to be trusted. It was a revolution made not through conquest, but through calm design. Within each lantern, the balance between fragility and control became art. The wick was trimmed, the oil measured, the air holes placed just so. The craftsmen who built these small cages of light did not think of themselves as saviors or scientists. They were caretakers. Their task was to create a vessel that allowed the living flame to breathe without escaping. To hold light without harm was to mirror the human condition itself. To carry warmth while restraining its excess. The lantern glowed like a beating heart behind bars of gold and iron. It was not imprisonment, but harmony. When the wind howled against the windows, the lantern stayed steady. Its light no longer swayed wildly or died in panic. It cast long, slow shadows along the walls, turning each room into a small theater of stillness. People learned to read, to write, to think by this gentle light. The candle that once destroyed now became the source of reflection. Around it, conversation softened, labor lengthened, thought deepened. Fire had become a teacher. In the glow of its cage, the human mind found time to see itself. But even as safety grew, reverence remained. Those who tended to their flames did so with care, cleaning the glass, trimming the wick, refilling the oil. It was a ritual, quiet and precise, the continuation of a pact made centuries before. The flame, though tamed, was never forgotten as a force of its own. The boundary between destruction and illumination was still thin, and within that thinness lay respect. People learned to live alongside danger, not in opposition to it. The metal frame did not end the threat, it taught coexistence. As time passed, glass joined the metal. The cage grew transparent, transforming from defense into beauty. Light no longer flickered wildly, but glowed with calm persistence. The lanterns that hung in monasteries, along streets and within carriages became symbols of both wisdom and vigilance. Each one contained within it a small echo of the sun, a captured star that reminded its keeper of the fragile order holding the world together. The flame no longer consumed, it revealed. And in that revelation, humanity saw its reflection. Restless, bright, always in need of a boundary. Then when the age of electricity arrived, the lantern slowly disappeared. Yet its essence endured. The filament that glows inside a bulb still remembers the old flame. The switch that brings light at a touch is the descendant of the same impulse, to bring brightness without danger, to see without fear. The cage became invisible, built now of wire and glass, but the lesson it carried remains the same, that safety is not the absence of power, but its containment. Even now, when the night feels secure and the rooms glow evenly with electric light, there is something in the way shadows move that recalls the candle's dance. The flame still lives, hidden within the memory of warmth. Every lamp, every bulb, every silent glow is a continuation of the first act of care. The moment someone placed metal around fire and called it peace. The fire's cage was not a prison, it was an understanding that light, to endure, must be given shape. That warmth, to comfort, must be held with gentleness. And that creation, to be safe, must listen to its own limits. In the history of human invention, few things were as small or as transformative. From the trembling wick to the silent lamp, each spark carried the same quiet truth, that protection is not resistance, but balance. The lantern still flickers in that truth today, its glow moving softly across centuries, a steady reminder that even the most dangerous light, when guided with care, can illuminate without consuming and burn without ever again bringing ruin. The thought of separation. In the old world, before chimneys reached the sky and iron stoves hummed with precision, the kitchen was not merely a room, it was a force. The hearth stood at the center of every home, glowing like a living heart, its pulse steady and unpredictable. Fire was both servant and master. It cooked food, forged tools, warmed the body through nights of frost, and yet, with one breath too long or spark too far, it turned comfort into ruin. Whole houses, woven of thatch and timber, were lost in a sigh of flame. Villages watched the horizon turn orange and said prayers to the night. And still, every morning, they lit the fire again. For without it, life itself seemed colder, smaller, incomplete. The earliest homes gathered around a single flame. A pit of ash, a few stones, a circle where families sat and ate and dreamed. The smoke rose into the rafters or escaped through cracks in the roof. The air inside was thick, carrying the scent of stew, earth, and burning sap. Children coughed softly in their sleep. Walls grew black with soot. Fire was not separate from life. It was part of the breath of the house. Yet this closeness, this intimacy with danger, could not last forever. The same flame that simmered broth also whispered of loss. As generations passed, memory began to take note. People started to see the pattern, the repetition of destruction that followed familiarity. The kitchen, once the symbol of survival, became the lesson of caution. In great halls and small cottages alike, the same story repeated. A spark leapt from the pot, a cloth fell too near, a servant nodded off beside the coals. In minutes, the air turned to heat, the ceiling to stars. Those who rebuilt their homes afterward did so with a new awareness, a quiet determination to keep warmth, but not peril. And so began the long process of separation, the slow decision to give fire its own place, to move the hearth away from the heart of living. At first, the change was simple. Some households built stone walls around the cooking area. Others set their kitchens at the edges of their homes, half enclosed, half open to the air. The flames still burned, but now with a measured distance. The kitchen became a space between, neither fully inside nor outside, both domestic and elemental. The people who cooked there worked under roofs of smoke-darkened beams, where the air was cooler, the light more forgiving. The sound of fire became a background hum rather than the breath of the entire house. This new arrangement carried more than practicality, it carried philosophy. It was a recognition that safety was not the denial of need, but the shaping of it. By placing fire apart, humanity began to understand the wisdom of distance, that certain forces, though essential, must be respected through space. It was not fear that built the separate kitchen, it was maturity. The act of dividing warmth from rest, appetite from destruction, was a quiet revolution in thought. It turned chaos into pattern and accident into awareness. The builders of these first detached kitchens learned through patience. They saw how stone resisted what wood could not, how walls could guide heat rather than absorb it. The ovens they built were rounded like cradles, their openings small to contain the flame. Floors were made of packed earth or brick, cool beneath bare feet. The walls echoed with sound, the crackle of wood, the hiss of boiling broth, the low murmur of voices working in rhythm. And beyond those walls, the living quarters stayed untouched. Children slept, elders rested, life continued in calm. The separation had done what hope alone could not. It allowed peace to coexist with power. As centuries passed, the idea spread across cultures and continents. In Europe's great estates, kitchens were built in wings apart from the main halls, their chimneys rising like watchtowers of smoke. In Asia, courtyards enclosed the fire beneath open sky. In the Americas, small outdoor hearths stood behind wooden homes, glowing like small suns at dusk. Everywhere, the same principle took hold, the realization that warmth should be near enough to serve, but far enough to spare. Even as societies advanced, the memory of fire's lessons lingered in every blueprint. Yet for all its danger, the kitchen remained a place of comfort. Those who worked by the hearth knew its moods as one knows a living creature. They spoke to it, tended to it, fed it with careful hands. The cook became a keeper of balance, an artist of heat and restraint. Within the glow of the fire, food transformed, aromas filled the air, and families gathered not only for sustenance, but for belonging. The act of eating, once tied to survival, became tied to memory. The warmth of the kitchen, though separated, still reached through walls to touch the lives it sustained. Even when night came and the fires burned low, their glow continued through cracks in stone and the faint warmth of the floor. Those who lay awake could sense it, the steady pulse of life beyond the room beating quietly in the distance. It was a reassurance that comfort could exist without danger, that warmth need not demand sacrifice. The flame had not been banished, it had been given its rightful space. And in that small act of rearrangement, the foundation of safety was laid. With time, as architecture evolved, the distance shortened again. Chimneys drew smoke upward, stoves confined heat to metal boxes, and kitchens rejoined the home in new, gentler forms. Yet even in these returns, the wisdom of separation remained. The walls might have disappeared, but the boundaries lingered, invisible, understood. The modern kitchen, with its quiet hum of machines and soft electric glow, is a descendant of that same ancient idea. That peace is not the absence of fire, but its careful place within our world. The hearths apart were not signs of fear, but of comprehension. They marked the moment when humanity looked at flame and saw not an enemy, but a partner that needed space to breathe. Through distance, safety was born. Through balance, comfort endured. And as the last sparks of each day faded into ash, the kitchens of stone and smoke continued to whisper the same truth, that the boundaries we build are not walls against life, but frames that allow it to endure. The thought of separation, once born of necessity, became an art of wisdom. It taught that love, warmth, and survival all thrive best when tended with care, when given room to burn without consuming, to shine without destroying, to live without endangering the quiet rhythm of home. The language of silence, safety by sound and order. Long before the science of storms was understood, people listened to the sky as though it were alive. The first sound of thunder was a warning that felt personal, a great voice speaking from clouds that could neither be seen nor questioned. Villages huddled in valleys or on hillsides heard it roll across the fields like the slow turning of the earth itself. Fear came with the flash that followed, a light that split the heavens and turned night briefly to day. In that blinding moment, homes burned, trees shattered, and men who sought to ring church bells were struck down where they stood. They did not yet know that lightning followed metal, that sound could not soothe a storm. Still in their hearts they believed that noise could fight what silence could not. Bells rang not for warning, but for hope. The belief that if they filled the air with courage, the sky might listen and relent. The great bells of stone towers tolled during tempests with a rhythm of devotion and defiance. Their sound traveled miles, trembling through air, thick with rain and electricity. Within the villages, people crossed themselves and waited for the thunder to fade. But the storms paid no mind. The fire from the sky did not fear the bell. It followed its own invisible path. In time, the bells fell silent, not from loss of faith, but from understanding. Through centuries of burnt towers and fallen ringers, people learned that protection lay not in noise, but in knowledge. When the first rods of metal rose toward the sky, tall and deliberate, they looked like gestures of humility rather than defiance, a way to greet the heavens with reason, to invite danger into a safe embrace. The lightning that once struck bell towers now found the rod instead, its fury drawn harmlessly into the ground, For the first time, storms could rage without ruin. This quiet invention marked a change not only in safety, but in thought. Humanity had begun to listen differently. To the world, to one another, to the sound of its own wisdom. The language of protection no longer shouted. It hummed softly, spoke through design rather than prayer. Bells no longer needed to fight the storm. They could guide people instead. In every town, their tone shifted from alarm to order. The curfew bell, ringing at dusk, became the voice of safety, not of fear. Its slow toll reminded the streets to empty, fires to dim, doors to close. It was a call toward stillness, toward preservation. The same sound that once sought to repel lightning now drew people toward calm. As night settled, the world changed its rhythm. The clang of hammers and the chatter of trade gave way to the softer sounds of footsteps returning home. The curfew was not a command. It was a kind of collective sigh. The air cooled, the lamps flickered, and the city's pulse slowed. Streets that had been alive with commerce now filled with the hush of expectation. The silence that followed the final bell was not empty. It was structured, meaningful. It carried the weight of protection. In that quiet, fires were covered, animals penned, doors latched. Danger was not banished, but acknowledged and respected. This new order of sound, bells that signaled peace rather than panic, gave birth to something deeper: trust. Communities began to recognize the rhythm of safety as something shared, something built from repetition rather than force. A bell ringing each night became as certain as the moon's rise. Its tone was a boundary between labor and rest, between chaos and quiet. The people did not need guards shouting orders or soldiers in the street. The sound itself was enough, a single note that reminded them of care, of balance. It was the architecture of calm made audible. Beyond the walls of towns, in distant monasteries and villages, this rhythm deepened. Monks rose and slept by the bell's timing, shaping their days around an order of sound that mirrored the order of thought. Each tone divided the day not as command but as comfort. Work began with one note, ended with another. In this harmony, safety was not only physical, it became spiritual in its quietest sense. To live by rhythm was to live with awareness. The bell, once a symbol of fear, became a teacher of patience. And still outside the cities, silence continued to carry its own wisdom. In the countryside, there were no towers to toll the hour. There, safety was measured by listening. To the wind that told of rain, to the river that swelled before flood, to the animals whose unease foretold the storm. These were older sounds, subtler but no less protective. The people who lived close to the land learned to read these murmurs as surely as scholars read books. They knew that to survive was to hear the world before it spoke too loudly. Silence was not absence, it was signal. The quiet before thunder, the stillness before frost, the pause before nightfall. Each one was a message, a conversation between the earth and its listeners. In every age, the connection between safety and sound deepened. Cities built bells for order, ships rang them for time and warning, and clocks turned their echoes into precision. Yet beneath all this, silence remained the truest foundation. The quiet after the bell, the calm that followed the warning. These were the moments when people understood that peace is not made by noise, but by attention. The absence of chaos became a form of protection in itself. When lightning rods spread across Europe and beyond, they did more than ground storms. They changed the language of fear. The bell ringer no longer needed to climb into danger. The sky no longer needed to be appeased by sound. Humanity had learned to listen differently, not to shout into the wind, but to work with it. The noise of protection gave way to the quiet of design. A rod stood where a man once stood, tall but still, channeling violence into the ground. The storm still spoke, but it no longer destroyed. It was the first true conversation between the human mind and the elements. A dialogue written in metal and patience. By the time the modern world arrived, filled with clocks, horns and machines, the ancient rhythm still lingered beneath the surface. Every siren, every signal, every soft hum of routine safety can trace its ancestry to those early bells and their lessons. The language of silence taught people to live with awareness of danger, not in its denial. It showed that care could be collective, that sound could be gentle and still strong. Even now, when storms roll across the land and electricity hums through the wires, the wisdom remains the same. The bell that once tolled in vain now echoes quietly in memory, its voice transformed. It speaks not of fear, but of structure. The simple truth that safety is rhythm, and rhythm is peace. The world continues to turn beneath that invisible order, a balance between sound and silence, between the warning of thunder and the hush that follows. And in that hush, humanity continues to find its calm, not in defiance of the storm, but in the steady, measured stillness that listens, learns, and endures. The quiet tools of the body, from armor to air. In the long rhythm of human endurance, protection has always begun at the surface of the body. Flesh, though resilient, was never meant for iron. The first warriors learned this with every clash of blade and shield, that courage alone could not turn aside steel, and that survival required patience as much as power. Beneath the gleam of armor lay something humbler, softer, the gambeson, a quilt of linen and wool layered close to the skin. It was not meant to dazzle, only to cushion. The cloth absorbed the shock of strikes, slowed the bite of edges, and gave space for breath between the man and the metal that encased him. It was warmth beneath coldness, silence beneath noise. The soldier who wore it moved slower but lasted longer, carrying not only the weight of war but the understanding that safety could live within simplicity. The padding, though heavy and hot, carried a kind of mercy. It did not shine in the sun like polished plate, nor did it inspire fear in the eyes of enemies, but it was loyal, soft where the world was hard. Its threads held sweat, dust, and the faint smell of smoke from countless days under armor. When the fight ended and the helmets came off, the gambeson bore the marks of survival, cuts half-stopped, bruises half-healed. In the quiet after battle, men would hang these garments to dry, steam rising from the fabric like breath returning to the air. It was a simple technology, but within its weave lay the first form of human ergonomics, the idea that safety must begin not outside the body but beside it. As centuries passed, the lesson deepened. What began on battlefields spread into daily life. The same principle that softened the blow of iron began to soften the hazards of living. Builders who once climbed towers bare-handed learned to wrap ropes around their waists. Workers in forges layered cloth over their arms to block the heat of flame. The world itself became a kind of armor, reshaped through slow care. Each wall, bridge, and chimney carried the same quiet logic, that endurance required not defiance, but accommodation. To live safely was to listen, to air, to wait, to movement. The chimney, rising above the home, was a second skin for the house itself. Before it, smoke filled the lungs of families, turning comfort into suffocation. The hearth that once promised warmth often gave poison instead. It took centuries for someone to notice that the air inside needed escape, that breath required structure. When the first flues were built, narrow and tall, they did more than guide smoke outward. They gave life inward. The room cleared, the air turned lighter, and for the first time, people could sleep beside their fires without choking in their dreams. The chimney, like the gambeson, was a buffer, a layer between the body and what it required to survive. In the same spirit, bridges began to change. The early ones, made of wood and rope, trembled under the passage of men and beasts. They sang with danger, a low groan with every step, a whisper of collapse waiting in the wind. As stone replaced timber and chains replaced vines, the earth learned to carry its own weight more patiently. The bridges that crossed rivers and valleys no longer demanded faith alone. They offered trust built on reason. Each chain that linked the structure together was like a thread in a greater gambeson, absorbing the strain, distributing the burden. The bridge became not just a path, but a form of safety, a symbol of endurance through balance. In towns, windows of glass began to appear. They caught the light of morning and held it, but they also held back the wind. Before their arrival, homes breathed too freely. Every draught a reminder of the thin line between comfort and cold. The glass, fragile yet steadfast, transformed that relationship. It sealed warmth within without stealing air, allowing people to see the world while remaining untouched by it. In its transparency lay another lesson of protection, that safety did not always require hiding, only shaping the space between exposure and shelter. Temples too learned the same rhythm. The stone walls that once trapped smoke from candles and incense began to open with vents and domes. Light and air flowed through sacred spaces, carrying breath to both body and spirit. The world was learning to build in layers, to separate what harms from what heals without severing the connection entirely. Every innovation, from armor to architecture, spoke of patience, not conquest. It was a conversation between the body and the air, the earth and the mind, danger and endurance. The craftsmen who forged these tools and structures rarely thought of themselves as inventors of safety. They worked from instinct, from observation. A blacksmith noticed the way heat escaped through cracks in the forge and shaped his own chimney. A soldier, weary of bruises, stitched an extra layer of wool beneath his cuirass. A mason, watching the rain wear down his bridge, wove metal into stone to share the strain. Each act was small, but together they formed the language of quiet invention, the art of listening to need before responding to it. And within that quiet, life began to feel less fragile. Cities grew taller, homes warmer, work steadier. The same iron that once cut became protection. The same fire that once destroyed became warmth and progress. Humanity learned that strength alone could not endure. Only the harmony between softness and resilience could. The gambeson beneath the armor was mirrored by the air within the chimney, the chain within the bridge, the glass within the wall. Every structure, no matter how grand or humble, carried a hidden gentleness, a layer of care unseen but deeply felt. By the time machines replaced swords and battles moved from fields to factories, the philosophy had already taken root. Helmets became lighter but smarter. Gloves became not armor but comfort. The same principle guided it all: protect the body, preserve the breath. The line from the padded cloth of the medieval knight to the steel beams of modern architecture is not a line of progress, but of patience. The same lesson, repeated through centuries in different forms. Safety is not built in haste. It is woven slowly, like linen layered against the skin. Even now, the world continues to live by those quiet tools. The air that flows through vents, the bridges that hum beneath footsteps, the glass that holds back storms, all of them are descendants of that early understanding. They are the body's extensions, its outer skin shaped by thought and care. The armor has changed, but the purpose remains. We still protect our breath, our movement, our fragile balance between need and restraint. In the stillness of this long story, one truth endures, that every act of safety is also an act of listening. The body listens to the world, and the world in turn listens back. The weight of armor and the rise of air are not opposites, but harmonies, two halves of a single rhythm that keeps humanity alive. From iron to smoke, from breath to bridge, from cloth to glass, the same pulse continues, the quiet tools of the body, built not from strength alone, but from patience, gentleness, and the unending desire to endure. Voices Within Walls, the hidden lives of women. Behind stone walls and narrow courtyards, life moved in a rhythm so quiet it seemed almost outside of time. The convents of the medieval world stood apart from the noise of cities, built on hillsides or near rivers, surrounded by fields that marked the edge between solitude and the living world. Within those walls, women woke before dawn, when the air was still cool and the sky only beginning to pale. The first bell rang low and distant, its tone rolling through corridors lined with cold stone. Lamps flickered in alcoves as figures in simple robes crossed the floors, their steps echoing softly. They were not queens or scholars in the way history remembers, yet their lives were threaded with a kind of strength that endured beyond any crown or title. Their world was one of order and calm repetition, a balance between labor and contemplation, between silence and the faint hum of prayer. The convent was a world built from patience. Its walls were thick, not only to keep danger out, but to hold time still. Each day followed the same sequence: the bell, the meal, the work, the prayer. Yet within that sameness, thought quietly bloomed. The women copied manuscripts by the faint light of oil lamps, their ink dark and careful, their handwriting even as breath. They studied the plants that grew along the garden wall, learning which leaves could soothe pain, which roots could preserve life. They recorded what they learned in the margins of old texts, small notes that might one day guide someone else. These writings were not meant for glory. They were meant to endure. Even the smallest record, a list of herbs, a quiet reflection on light through glass, became part of the slow, invisible architecture of knowledge that bridged generations. The silence inside the convent was not a void. It was a kind of conversation. The women spoke with their hands, through work, through gestures of care so subtle they hardly seemed to move. When one fell ill, another brought her water. When one faltered in her duties, another took her place. No sound was wasted. In the absence of noise, every small act became meaningful. The air carried the soft rhythm of brooms over stone, the turn of pages, the faint crackle of fire in the hearth. There were moments of laughter too, quiet, fleeting, hidden beneath the formality of ritual. Even in stillness, life continued to hum with warmth. Outside, the world was restless, wars, famines, the rise and fall of kingdoms. Inside, time unfolded like a calm tide. When danger drew near, the gates closed, and the women continued their work as if untouched. When peace returned, they reopened their gardens and tended to what had survived. The simplicity of their existence was its own form of resistance against the chaos beyond the walls. They did not fight, but they preserved. They did not command, but they remembered. Each prayer, each line of ink, each moment of endurance became a thread in a vast, unseen web of continuity that stretched across centuries. Though bound by duty, many found freedom within the confines of silence. Some wrote poetry in hidden books, their verses describing the turning of seasons, the memory of dreams, or the light of dawn upon the cloister walls. Others studied the stars, tracking their paths across the narrow slice of sky visible from the courtyard. There were women who drew diagrams of the plants they tended, recording their shapes with astonishing precision. Their curiosity was quiet, but it was endless. In a world where the voices of women were rarely heard, the convent became a rare refuge for thought. What could not be spoken was written. What could not be shared aloud was passed in fragments of script, in glances, in the long continuity of hands doing the same work across generations. There were moments of longing too, for freedom, for sound, for the lost touch of the outside world. The bells that marked the hours could feel both comforting and confining. Yet even in confinement, they found meaning. The repetition of ritual became a rhythm of stability. In the stillness, the women learned to see in ways the restless world could not. They noticed how sunlight moved through the windows across the day, how dust drifted like small galaxies in the light, how seasons spoke through color, green in spring, gold in autumn, white in the long, slow quiet of winter. Through attention, they discovered a form of beauty untouched by time or fashion. Their labor was constant and unseen. They spun wool, wove linen, pressed herbs into oils, and bound books by hand. Each task carried memory, each motion was a form of care. They tended not only to their own lives, but to the continuity of the human story. Keeping knowledge intact, preserving language, caring for one another in a world that too often forgot tenderness. Theirs was the quiet labor that made endurance possible. Even when their names vanished, their influence lingered in the persistence of art, medicine, and written thought that survived because of their hands. When night fell, the halls grew colder, and the sound of their chanting floated through the dark. The lamps flickered like distant stars, each flame a small defiance against oblivion. They sang not to be heard, but to remember, to mark the passage of time in the same way the tide marks the shore. Some nights the air was still enough that their voices carried beyond the walls, drifting into the world they rarely saw. Villagers passing in the distance would pause, hearing only the harmony of unseen lives, the echo of calm that came from within. In their final years, many of these women faded into the same silence they had tended all their lives. They left behind pages filled with careful script, recipes for remedies, small journals of weather and growth. Their legacies were not monuments, but murmurs, knowledge that continued to move long after their bodies rested. Centuries later, when their writings were found in libraries and archives, the ink had faded, but the meaning endured. The notes in the margins revealed a world that had never truly been silent. It had only been patient, waiting to be heard. Their voices, though quiet, shaped the path of knowledge. Through them, the world learned that wisdom does not always come with noise or command. Sometimes it grows in the soft rhythm of repeated care, in the tending of gardens, the turning of pages, the still gaze upon the stars. These women taught by example that safety and strength can exist within restraint, that thought can move freely even when the body cannot. Their calm was a form of endurance, their silence a vessel for knowledge. Now, when we look back across centuries, we find them not as shadows, but as steady lights. They remind us that history is not only written by those who speak loudest, but also by those who listen longest. Their patience preserved the world. Their hands carried forward the fragile continuity of understanding. Within those walls they built not monuments but memory, an architecture of care that still holds the foundations of our thought. Theirs was the voice beneath history, the quiet pulse within its heart. And through that stillness they remain, alive, enduring, and endlessly present in the calm rhythm of the world that followed, top of form. Bottom of form. Kings and shadows, the human thread. Within palaces built of marble and light, power lived beside silence. Behind every crown was a human heart, fragile beneath the weight of gold. Kings and queens walked among symbols of eternity, pillars carved with gods, floors that gleamed with the dust of conquest. Yet the air they breathed carried the same uncertainty as any other life. Their rule reached across oceans and borders, but not across desire, not across loneliness. When the hall emptied and torches dimmed, even the strongest rulers faced the same quiet truth. The body could be protected by armies, but the spirit remained undefended. In those still hours before dawn, when the city below slept, the sound of their own heartbeat became their most loyal companion. The palace was a place of order, yet within that order lay restlessness. Courtiers moved like shadows, their words polished, their gestures measured. The ruler at the center of it all was watched by hundreds and understood by none. To speak freely was dangerous, to stay silent was heavy. In that strange balance, affection became a secret language, loyalty a kind of faith. History remembers thrones, but not the faces turned toward them. The servants lighting the lamps, the scribes writing late into the night, the hands that straightened the folds of a robe before the audience began. These unnoticed figures witnessed the human moments behind grandeur, the sigh after anger, the trembling hand signing mercy, the quiet apology no one was meant to hear. Desire, pride, and regret all found their home within walls of luxury. Some rulers sought love beyond law, finding in forbidden companionship a brief escape from solitude. Others withdrew entirely, surrounding themselves with mirrors of obedience, seeing only what flattery allowed. Yet even the most distant monarch could not silence the ache of the heart. Power gave them control over land, not over longing. In the warmth of private chambers, far from ceremony, they faced what every person eventually faces, the limits of their own design. They could command armies, but not affection, decree peace, but not peace of mind. The letters left behind reveal this hidden tenderness. Ink faded, but emotion endured. There were notes written to friends long lost, messages never sent, reflections scribbled in margins of philosophy. Within these fragments lies the truer story of kings, not of conquest, but of conscience. A ruler writing at midnight asked if kindness could survive authority. Another described the sound of rain against stone, the way it reminded him of his childhood before the crown. These moments were not grand enough for monuments, yet they were the threads that kept their humanity intact. For those who lived under them, the king was a figure both distant and familiar. To the soldier, he was a reason to fight. To the farmer, a name on the tax ledger. To the servant, a quiet presence glimpsed by candlelight. And yet, when the ruler's face softened, when laughter replaced command, when gratitude replaced pride, those who saw it remembered. Generations later, when the stories were told again, the cruelty of the throne had faded, but the tenderness remained. Power may build monuments, but memory preserves gentleness. In some courts, kindness became the unseen law. There were kings who forgave enemies instead of destroying them, who ordered bread to be given before punishment, who built libraries before prisons. Their reigns were brief in the record of war, but long in the breath of humanity. These were not rulers of conquest, but caretakers of peace. Even when they failed, the effort itself became a kind of legacy, proof that mercy could exist even among crowns. History, when told slowly, reveals that gentleness is not weakness, but the rarest kind of strength. Others, driven by pride, fell into their own shadows. Isolation grew thicker than armor. The crown became a wall between ruler and world. In their solitude, their reflection became their only witness. Yet even here, in the quiet decay of power, there was something deeply human. The recognition that all control is temporary. In the final silence, they were left with the same question as those who had nothing. Had they been kind enough, known enough, lived enough? Time does not answer, but it listens. It softens judgment, turns tyranny into cautionary tale, and arrogance into lesson. The anger of the past dissolves into understanding, and the once feared names become whispers of empathy. The people who served them carried the truest memories. They recalled not the orders shouted in anger, but the hesitations, the unguarded gestures, the ruler pausing to watch the sunrise, or the queen tracing patterns in the dust of the windowsill. These small moments, invisible to historians, became the quiet archive of humanity. They survived in stories, in songs, in the rhythm of how people remembered. When all else faded, what endured was not the rule of law, but the rule of care. Through centuries, power has changed its form, but not its essence. Whether a crown of gold, a seal of wax, or a name on paper, it carries the same fragile heart beneath. The human thread runs through all, through palace and hut alike. To govern others is to confront the self, to learn that control is never complete, that the soul requires gentleness as the body requires rest. This truth has crossed empires like wind across plains, unseen but constant. It hums beneath every age that to rule wisely is to understand weakness, to forgive it in others, and perhaps, at last, in oneself. When time folds over these stories, the noise fades, the crowns crumble, the banners fade, the words of command turn to dust. What remains is a kind of stillness, the echo of lives once filled with longing, love, and quiet endurance. Across the ruins of palaces, one can still feel the warmth of human breath, the pulse of care that outlasted power. The servants, the scribes, the kings and the queens, all bound together by the same fragile wish to be safe, to be known, to be remembered with gentleness. In the end, the shadow of power softens into the light of understanding. History, seen through the long distance of time, becomes less a ledger of triumphs and failures, and more a tapestry of hearts, learning, faltering, and continuing. The thread between sovereign and servant remains unbroken. It winds through centuries, through every life touched by the hope for peace. And in that shared stillness, that breath between stories, we find what all rulers sought and all people continue to seek, the quiet, enduring grace of simply being human. The night grows still again, and the last traces of movement fade into the gentle breath of the earth. The inventions that once flickered with purpose now dissolve into shadow. The moats that once circled stone walls lie quiet beneath the stars, their waters calm and silver. The fires that once burned bright behind their cages glow only faintly now, soft as memory. The sound of the bell that guided lives through danger, through curfew and storm, has long since quieted. What remains is the deep and patient rhythm of the world itself, the same pulse that has endured across every age. Calm, unbroken, endlessly slow. The air carries the faint scent of smoke and iron, of labor long finished. In this stillness, you can almost feel the presence of the countless hands that shaped safety into being. those who built, who mended, who learned through trial. They do not speak anymore, yet their lessons remain all around you, silent but clear. The world is filled with their traces. Water sleeps beneath stone bridges held steady by the weight of centuries. Walls stand smooth beneath moonlight, their edges worn by wind and care. The fire, once tamed and caged, still burns low behind glass, its warmth gentle, its danger subdued. These are not the relics of progress, but the quiet achievements of patience, the marks of a species that learned, over thousands of years, to protect rather than conquer. Each invention, no matter how humble, was born from attention. The careful observation of what could go wrong, the quiet determination to prevent it from happening again. The moat, the wall, the candle cage, the lid, the chimney. Each a word in the long, unbroken language of safety. And through them, the world learned how to survive without fear. Now the centuries rest. The voices that once shouted across marketplaces and battlefields have fallen to whispers. What remains is not their noise but their rhythm, the enduring cadence of effort and endurance. You rest within that rhythm now, surrounded by the quiet wisdom of those who came before. The earth beneath you is steady, shaped by their labor and softened by time. Every brick, every beam, every carved rail is a gesture of care, left behind by hands that are gone but not forgotten. The same patience that once kept the fire from spreading, that once lifted the smoke away from the lungs, still moves quietly through the world, guiding it toward balance. The lessons of safety are the lessons of tenderness. They were never forged in conquest or decree, but in small, deliberate acts of attention. A mother teaching her child not to touch the flame, a builder smoothing the edge of stone, a watchman lighting the path home before night. Across time, these gestures have replaced fear with calm. What began as survival became compassion. What began as necessity became wisdom. That wisdom now fills the silence. It hums beneath the ground, glows faintly in the fading light, and lingers in the still air around you. You breathe in, and the world breathes with you. The dust of centuries, the warmth of long-dead fires, the echoes of distant bells, all of it gathers softly here, in this single moment of stillness. There is nothing left to guard, nothing left to fear. The walls have done their work, the flames have been contained, the bridges have held. The world, for now, is enough. The weight of history no longer presses, it cradles. Let the centuries drift into quiet now. Let the inventions return to their shadows, where they can rest beside the hands that made them. The night has gathered all lessons into itself, and in its calm, the boundaries between ages dissolve. You lie within that silence, surrounded by the calm pulse of everything that has ever lived. The fire burns low but steady. The air cools, clear and forgiving. The past no longer demands to be remembered. It simply remains, folded into the patience of the earth. The sound of the world's breath continues deep and even, a lullaby sung by time itself. And so the story returns to where it began, to quiet, to warmth, to stillness. Water beneath stone, fire behind glass. The long hum of safety stretching across the centuries. The world turns slowly, its rhythm unchanged. History rests, not gone but sleeping. And within that rest, within that long exhale of time, there is peace. The world is safe enough to sleep.